here in Pretoria. The structure of this presentation is as follows. So I'll give some kind of an introduction at first, and then from there, I'll present some emerging results for Mozambique, focusing on maize. And then after that, I'll also focus on Malawi, and then Zambia. Then the presentation is going to end with some conclusions and some recommendations for possibly for policymakers. Yeah, so I think as all of you know already, the pandemic for the COVID, I think, came to Africa slightly late, but still by January, February 2020, governments were already becoming aware that there is a problem, because they would easily see what was happening in the Western countries, especially in Spain, as well as in Italy, in France, well, in China too. And so although the first COVID cases within the Southern Africa region were reported later in say, for example, in March, by February, a lot of talking had already started on those ones. And control measures were already starting to take place for example, in form of messages on the radios to warn people that it is not useful to start to just walk aimlessly. And after some time, these also grew into or matured into some outright restrictions on some things. For example, restrictions on movements of people, some bans in marketplaces in some cases, and also cross-border activities were so limited as the pandemic, as it became clear that we had a pandemic even in the Southern Africa region, and especially seeing at what was happening in South Africa. And so most of these, or all of these activities or responses were basically not necessarily intended badly. I think there was a pandemic to a threat to react to, and those reactions were reasonable at the moment in terms of the goal. But inevitably, so most of those, to the extent that they limited the amount of demand or they limited the amount of movement, so therefore supply of stocks, etc., they are probably likely to have some impacts or some effects on prices of commodities. And in this work, it is of interest for us to try and see what kind of impact do we see, or at least what kind of interesting associations are we able to see from this data, and what would be then the kind of implications that we might have for policy, as well as for future potential reactions to similar situation. And as I said, the focus is on Mozambique, Zambia, and Malawi. So just as an introduction, a light introduction, so Mozambique, Zambia, and Malawi are neighbors. These countries, they are heavily agrarian. I mean, they rely more on agriculture to do things. Of course, Zambia now is kind of also diversifying to a lot. I think Koba is providing a lot of other, a lot to the fiscus of that country. But generally, these are agrarian economies. Okay, the kind of maize that they rely on. So maize is the staple food in those countries, but most of the maize is locally produced. Of course, that does not mean that they do not buy some maize from elsewhere, as it is within a country. Even if that country has a surplus of a commodity, chances are that the bordering districts or some places, they will still be able to have to import from elsewhere, because there is always heterogeneity in terms of availability of any commodity in most of these countries. So there's also kind of some activity within the countries themselves in terms of buying as well as selling of maize. The major production regions for maize, and I think most agricultural commodities in Mozambique, are mainly located in the northern part of the country and the central part of the country. So here, for purposes of this exposition, we consider Zambezia, Nampula, Manica, and Tete provinces as almost food surplus, in the sense that they're strong producers of grain, right? And at the same time, if you consider Maputo, Gaza, and Inhambane, these provinces, we can consider them as deficit areas, or at least they're very different in terms of production potential compared to the first ones that I've talked about. So for purposes of this analysis here, we are considering the latter as deficit areas and the first set as surplus areas. Similar in Zambia, there are several provinces there, but we note that in the Eastern Province, this is the it has great agricultural potential, and the Central Province too. So for purposes of this analysis, we have data for those provinces and we consider them as surplus regions, whereas Lusaka and Copperbelt, we know that there's still agricultural activity taking place there, but these two cities, these two provinces are also unique in the sense that Lusaka is the capital city. There's loads of urbanization there. Copperbelt is a mining town. There is a lot of mining activity there. And relatively, therefore, they are less producers of agricultural commodities compared to the others. So we consider them for this particular analysis as deficit areas where maize would have to trek to in order to satisfy the enormous demand therein. In Malawi, Malawi is divided into 3 regions administratively. The first region is the northern region, and then we have the central region, and then also they have the southern region. Interestingly, there in Malawi, most agriculture is at the center and then in the northern region. So these are also places with fertile soils and where most of the agriculture for the country is practiced. The southern region also engages in agriculture, obviously, because Malawi is generally agrarian, but relatively, we can consider the southern region as a bit food deficient compared to the center as well as the north. Now, as I said earlier on, this does not imply that then at the center, no one is going to suffer from food insecurity. No, it doesn't mean that, but just at least for purposes of this, the center produces more, the north produces a lot, probably relative to the southern region. I think that is well documented. So with that background, maybe before I say that, I would also say that the in the case of Malawi, they also have 3 major cities. So one of them is Mzuzu, this other one is Blantyre, and the other one is Lilongwe. So Blantyre in the south, Lilongwe at the center, and Mzuzu in Mzimba in the northern region. So these are also places where there's a lot of urbanization, but I think most of urbanization is at the capital city in Lilongwe, and then maybe in Blantyre as a second. Those have also implications in terms of price dynamics, as we are going to see. So now this slide is presenting information about the price trends for Mozambique. What we are seeing in the emerging results is that if you if you group together the prices for the deficit areas that I talked about for Mozambique, and you graph them against also the prices for the food sufficient areas and the food surplus areas, you are bound to see that the maize grain prices seem to be consistently higher in the deficit areas of Mozambique. So, which is almost conforming to the fact that the categorization is kind of closer to reality. Plus also it's speaking to the importance of availability of food for price determination. So here, for example, this is where you would find the Maputos as well as the Imhambanis together. And down here for this one, the gray one, that's where you find the Tete, the Zambezia, Nampula provinces, right? But there is also one important observation that we can make from here. Yes, we know that it seems like cyclically every year there is some kind of a price hike around February, and then there's some kind of a drop. But if you also look at now in 2020, you'll find that this event seemed to be kind of a bit significant as well, right? So an enormous decline in prices over that particular period of time, which might also be because once we go towards March, April, May, in Mozambique, this is roughly now approaching the harvest seasons for most agricultural commodities. And therefore, probably the supply that comes with that tends to depress prices. Now, if you come here and if you go to the next slide and you graph the food surplus regions together and you graph the food deficit, maize deficit regions together, the first thing you note is that, okay, obviously the prices they differ even in those areas, which is what we would still expect, but the trend seems to be the same. By February, the prices are starting to decline and declining so quickly and steadily. And I think more so in the surplus regions compared to the deficit regions. There is a decline, yes, here, but you can see it's not as steep as the other ones in the surplus regions. So this might be might have something to do, obviously, with the fact that these areas are high producing areas, but could it also be the fact that this was a COVID year? I think that's the story we want to try and look at. So then we kind of further thought that we need to run a model. So we need we had data from Mozambique, and thanks to the Mozambique partners and government. The data runs for several years, and in the model that we run, so we run like an ARIMA model, adjusting for seasonality, and try to predict the prices for 2020, so that we can see if there is a difference between the prices that would have been predicted versus the prices that have been observed, both for the surplus region as well as the deficit region. So here, because we have combined the graphs, maybe let me try to point here. These graphs that are together here and everywhere, I think they're kind of high up there. These are the graphs, the blue one, this color is this pink. This one is the one which is the predicted, and the other one, it is the one which is the observed prices, right, for the deficit regions. For the surplus regions, we also see these two, one of which here is the predicted one, the other one is the observed one. So you can see here, the predictions seem to be okay, but but once now we try to predict for the 2020 from January to June, for which we had data, you start seeing that there is a big kind of there are differences between the predicted ones and the observed ones, and the same in the deficit areas. So there, then it starts saying something that, okay, there must be something also happening there, because we controlled for seasonality. This cannot only be explained by the fact that there is a lot of influx of new maize on the market. It must also be to do with something unique happening to the 2020 year. And from what we understand, at least for Mozambique, there could be other things also happening in 2020, but I think the major one is the COVID period. So we are thinking that probably what would have happened in this in Mozambique is the fact that the year 2020, by the time we're coming towards, by the time it became so obvious that there was COVID, the government started carrying out some activities on the sensitizing people so that the people are safe. But unintentionally, those messages and those confinement measures also meant that there is now less demand for the commodities, but and again, because I mean, domestically, nobody there's not a lot of people that are going to the markets as much, even if it was the case that there was no express message to say don't go to the markets. But once people are afraid, they're bound to change their behavior. So that withdrawal of demand or that reduction in demand, then coupled with the fact that there was also an influx of new maize from the new harvest season, led to having too much of the commodity on the markets. But while the demand, I mean, obviously, the demand is low, and the supply is high, then obviously from the simple laws of demand and supply, we know that the prices have to go to kind of go down. So this happened a lot in the surplus areas compared to the compared to the deficit areas, which can also be explained by the fact that the deficit areas, they don't have a lot anyway compared to the surplus areas. Now, what is interesting is that what we are observing there in Mozambique is not only unique to Mozambique. So if we go to Malawi, for example, you will find that in Malawi, the southern region, which I said earlier on that it's a deficit area, the prices are almost consistently higher across the year compared to the central as well as the northern region, which I think conforms with what we said earlier on in terms of production patterns, at least. So where you have a lot of maize, the demand for maize is low and the prices have to be lower. But where there is maize scarcity, of course, the demand, even at constant demand, you would still expect that the prices are going to be generally higher. But another important observation then is also that just like in Mozambique, you come to around January, February, there is a kind of a significant drop in the prices for maize. Now, we also know that even in 2019, there was a drop. But if you look here, if you examine the data for 2020, you'll find that the drop is even much more than in the preceding year, which starts also confirming the theory that it might not necessarily be the business cycles or the production, the seasonal issues. The fact that the fact that there is new maize on the market, but it could also be that such is valid, but there is also another factor at play there. And this is the same story that you get when you now examine the data at the major cities level. So if you look at Blantyre in the south, the prices are generally higher, right? And generally higher than in Lilongwe, and generally higher than, and Nzimba is enjoying, so Nzimba is where Nzuzu is, and the prices are also slightly kind of, they're lower consistently than the rest. So it's also talking to the same issue about production patterns. But at the same time, if you look at around March, February here, there's kind of a steep decline in the prices. And that decline also seems to be this much more than before, which leads to the question whether the COVID issues also had an impact on that. And now I should also say, just like in Mozambique, when the COVID issues came up, in Malawi, there were several efforts to try and sensitize people about the dangers of just being in public places and the dangers of moving around wantonly. There were also issues of sensitization about hand washing, and I think at some point after February, there was also a limitation in terms of crossing the borders, and at some point they were only allowing people to come back rather than to go out. and the Air Malawi stopped flying, etc. So all those actions, this is actually the key message also to all the countries that are under in focus here. All those actions obviously were noble actions, because the first thing to do was to try and protect people. After all, this is what also was happening and was being advised by the WHO, and that's what South Africa was doing, that's what Europeans were doing, and that's what China was also doing. So those were noble things, but inevitably, without intention, we also see that they might have had the effect of reducing demand and reducing movement of stocks from one place to the other, such that the places where which produce a lot of those food, a lot of the commodities, also had to see some kind of a decline in prices. And but not only those ones, but even in the places where food was already, I mean, where production is kind of naturally low. And here I should emphasize that the fact that we're saying the southern region is food deficient does not imply that it means that every point in time then there is always it's always going to be the case. They still harvest something. So because this is also a harvest period, you are bound to see that maybe the new harvests were also having an impact in terms of the price dynamics after February. But that impact was not the only one that was taking place. It would also seem that 2020 seemed to be a unique year. And if you try to find out from Malawi in terms of what is happening, what would have happened for them to be able to have a lot of a deep depression in prices like that, I don't think we get much information, except we know that they also suffered from the COVID issues. Because the other any other thing that might have that we would need to attribute this decline to would have to be a bumper harvest, and I don't think we have any stories from Malawi that says that they did have a lot of harvest that particular period of time. If anything, we know there were floods or just last year there. Okay, so now just as here, then we said, can we, because the data allowed us to do so, can we then try to look at all the most the markets which had data? So we kind of examined most of a lot of markets. I think about 23 markets from the rural areas and the urban areas, with the view of trying to just see at the global level what was happening. So here we note that for the rural areas, by January, most of the prices were increasing, even I mean in rural areas. However, after February, you start that now this blue is declining prices. You start seeing a share of the markets with declining prices. And this share of declining prices increased rapidly, so that by April, almost close to 80% of the markets in the rural areas were registering price decline. And by May, almost 100% of them were recording low prices compared to what the period before. Again, in the urban centers, you find that by January and February, the prices were increasing. But after February, there was a faster decrease in prices. So the red one is declining, the price decline. So, and by April, almost 100% of the markets were registering a price decline. And in May, the same. The interpretation from our perspective is that this is also related to, as much as it might be related to the fact that the new harvests are coming, new stocks of maize are coming, it is also likely related to the fact that over this period, there were messages about trying to be careful in terms of COVID, closing of some schools, as well as putting restrictions on movement to outside, which might also have meant that then instead of some maize stocks going to outside, they just had to stay there. And instead of maize stocks moving from high producing areas to low producing areas or wherever it was being stocked, they kind of remained like that. So this together with the new harvest led to this kind of decline. And as I said, nothing wrong about that yet, because these, if we think about it, governments had to try and still do something in order to reduce the impact of COVID. So just like we did in Mozambique, we also decided that we were going to feed some ARIMA models while controlling for seasonality, so that we just see what is happening to the predicted prices versus the prices that we observe. And here too, if you look at the urban maize prices, you'll find that the urban maize prices, the predicted ones, seem to be different from the ones that were observed, even if you control for seasonality. So the same in the rural areas. There's also the same effect. The observed ones seem to depart significantly from the predicted ones. Now, this story is the same as the one we have been talking about, but only that now is solidifying the evidence that probably 2020 was a unique year, because even if you account for the fact that it's a harvest season, there still seem to be a significant departure from the predicted prices, the prices which would be predicted by the model while controlling for seasonality, with the ones that are observed. And therefore, the interpretation in that respect is that something unique led to this. And from our understanding of what is happening, the COVID agenda within that period was significant in Malawi, and it kind of determined whether people were going to be very active on the markets, whether people were going to go to neighboring countries to trade, whether the imports or exports were going to take place. Now, to the extent that Malawi is a key producer of maize, obviously, and obviously, this had to lead to a depression in kind of in prices in that respect, and more so in the surplus markets or surplus areas than compared to the deficit areas. This part now presents data for Zambia. So in Zambia, we see that if we categorize, if we graph the COVID, the prices for the surplus regions and compare them with the deficit regions, yes, the graphs at some point cross here, but in general, I think we can agree that the surplus areas seem to be having consistently lower prices compared to, to be low compared to the deficit areas, which is also speaking about the same story that we have spoken for Malawi and for Mozambique, that prices seem to be partly determined by production, which I think should be obvious, but it is interesting to see it in the data as well. All right. But there's also another important element here, and that is to say the prices, just like in the other countries, seem to have taken a quick turn, at least towards the decline, both for the deficit areas and the surplus areas after February. So after February, you start seeing that there is a decline there, right? Which is kind of mimicking the Malawi situation as well as the Mozambique scenario. And if we try to graph them by putting the surplus ones together and the deficit ones together, just like that sample of areas, so you find that, yes, there are differences within a category, which is what we would still expect, because the fact that a market is a surplus market, or the fact that an area is a surplus market, does not necessarily imply that it will be to the same degree as another. So these differences are understandable, but the trends are kind of interestingly similar. And you can also see that there's a heavy and very strong decline here in the surplus areas compared to the decline in the deficit areas here. This is the same story that we have seen in Malawi and in Mozambique, that yes, we expect a huge decline in the surplus areas, And we expect a decline also in the deficit areas because we know they still produce maize there, and it's a harvesting season. But the degree of decline is going to be more in the surplus areas, simply because if you bar market activity, the place where maize is going to accumulate a lot, it will be the surplus areas, obviously. They are the ones that are not going to send it to places for other places for consumption. And so we should still expect a decline in a huge decline relatively in prices relative to the deficit areas. Now, for Zambia, the analysis that we have conducted thus far is we have not run the ARIMA model, simply because yes, we ran the ARIMA. We tried to run the ARIMA model, but we also recognize that the data set that we were using was kind of shorter, so it was about for 2 years. And if you do that, then we don't want problems. So in order to be sure that the story we're telling is kind of backed from statistical theory, then we have computed a simple difference in differences. So the difference in differences here, basically what they're doing is we want to see the price changes in 2019 from one month to the other. And we also compare that with the price changes in 2020 from one month to the other. And then we see what the differences are between those pairs. Because normally, if the years are the same, then we should expect that those differences are going to almost be negligible. So the differences for 2019 and the differences for 2020, they shouldn't be very different. But in this case, if you compute the difference in differences, you start seeing that actually that's not the case. In fact, because we are taking the difference, we are subtracting what we observe in 2019 from what we observe in 2020 and graph them, we find that actually 2020 is associated with more negativity in prices, right? So of course, there are these kind of exceptions to the general rule, but generally, you'll find that more frequently, the 2019 period has been associated with maize decline. So the changes in prices that we saw in 2019 were less downward sloping compared to the changes in 2020. So in simple terms, it means that the price decline that we are seeing in 2020 is much more than the price decline that we are seeing in 2019. So the question is, why should that be the case? This is the same story that is told from the ARIMA model. So, but what would be the leading reasons for that? Obviously, we can say, okay, some of this decline, of course, we know that it's the fact that it's a harvesting season, but really, there was also a harvesting season in 2019. So if you compare, it shouldn't really matter very much. But the reason there's a difference is because 2020 is a unique year. And therefore, there's something that is happening in Zambia to prices in Zambia as a result of 2020 being a unique year. Now, we tried to find out whether there was something so special in Zambia that led to the prices going down significantly and mimicking Malawi and Mozambique. And we see that, well, maybe Zambia can advise, but at least from our investigation, it will appear that the major part is the COVID issue. So just as Malawi and Mozambique, Zambia reacted to the COVID pandemic, seeing how South Africa was kind of suffering with that, and seeing how Europe was being bombarded with cases of COVID and the resultant deaths. They also moved on to try and limit that. So there were kind of directives to start social distancing, limiting travels, etc. All those led to other unintended effects. And as I said, those were noble actions, but they led to unintended effects on the markets to the extent that demand went down and supply constant, or then the result would have to be that prices have to go down in that respect, right? So, and again here, if you compare the deficit areas with the surplus areas, you can also see that in the deficit areas, okay, the tendency is that there are more positives than kind of, if you compare with the declines here. So prices are tend to decline even more in areas where you're producing more compared to the other areas. Okay. Now, so that's kind of the presentation that I wanted, the results that we wanted to share with you. But now, what are some of the recommendations that might be emerging from this work? So here we think that, yes, the COVID pandemic has led to different actions by governments, which were well intentioned, obviously, because they needed to limit the amount of suffering by people. But at the same time, because of those actions, we see that the pronouncements have also impeded kind of the tendency of markets to supply to each other depending on deficits. So they have impeded the arbitrage between markets. As a result, some markets have had to contend with a lot of supply at reduced demands, leading to a depression in terms of prices, a decline, an enormous decline in prices. And the reduced demand, together with the increase in the supplies resulting from the new season, they have together led to a kind of massive price decline, right? Now, the other direct confinement measures also. So the previous one we're talking about just maybe social distancing, etc. But also in each of these countries, there were also direct confinement and containment measures to try and limit the spread of the COVID. So even those ones, they also have led to downward trend in prices, because they affected movements of goods, and the other result is that, okay, the cost of food has gone down. Now, I should say, I think I'm going to allude to that later. This might look like it's very good, but I think we can discuss that later. And the confinements, this is the same point that I think that I was trying to make. Even between countries, the confinements have led to limited amounts of trade. And to the extent that Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia trade with each other, this has contributed to, unmade supply, or supply without the matching demand, leading to a decline in prices. Now, the potential negative impact from this observed decline in prices shows the critical importance of trans-border trade for smallholder farmers and small businesses. For instance, while the downward prices might imply that it has been good for consumers, but remember, this food is produced also by people who are part of the population. So that just means that they are receiving less to what they invested in whatever, whether it's a business of aggregating the maize or selling the maize. Actually, some of those people, if we were able to track them, we might find that there are casualties among producers or aggregators as a result of this COVID, because they found themselves with the low prices to sell their maize for. So those are important issues as far as policy is concerned, because as a government, you are not only looking after consumers, you're also trying to be producers. And especially now, we need to be producing more in order to advance our economies. Now, to avoid then enormous negative effects probably on demand, in future, it would be useful to kind of organize some of these restrictions in such a way that you don't lead to massive disruptions in market operations. So now the question is how? Obviously, with hindsight, we would say that it would be useful now maybe to start coining messages to which would be saying, yes, observe social distancing, but please, can we still be encouraged to go and trade while taking these other things, other than just outright banning of, outright banning of market activities. And that would have to take place even across borders, right? So another implication is that probably within the countries, and this we are just speculating because we do not have data on who was selling and what is their situation now. But we're saying it would also be useful within the governments to try and maybe help the small holder businesses which are engaging in aggregation of maize, and maybe to try and support them in some way. If there can be programs to support those people. We have seen that whether it's in Malawi, Mozambique, or in Zambia, there has been some kind of government effort to try and support some sections of the society, depending on the assumption that they have been impacted by COVID. I think given what we're seeing here, the producers as well as aggregators might also be candidates for that kind of support. So governments would have to think about how to do that. Then here it's just saying better targeting and early identification and isolation of affected areas would have to be useful to avoid large-scale disruption. So this might look like, okay, the COVID has already come and now countries are already dealing with it, but I think we should be thinking dynamically. This can happen again, either as a result of second waves or as a result of a new strain, and God forbid, we don't want that, but it can happen, nobody knew. So we have now the benefit, the advantage that we have learned from now here. Going forward, if that was to happen again, we would need now to try and marshal our interventions in such a way that we minimize disruptions on the markets. So by even trying to bring awareness in terms of the harm that can come with not trading within a country as well as across the country. With that, I think that's the end of this presentation. And this last slide is just an attempt to advertise a little bit about what we do. So if you want to know more about academia, which is leading the research program, you can come here. There's loads of reports, and even reports that we're going to upload after these presentations will be there. And as usual, as always, I know some of you go to the research website. It's also an important element to have links to academia. And there's going to be a meeting, a conference for Restax, the annual one, which is going to be virtual because of the COVID issue on 3 to 5 November. And I would encourage you to look for more information by writing an email to this email so that you can be invited if you are not invited already. I sit at the International Water Management Institute, which also does a lot of stuff, and everything we're talking about here is also related to water. So this is another website you can happily go there and start looking and expanding your knowledge about these issues. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and over to you.
Thank you, Greenwell. Thank you for this presentation. I know that a lot of data collection is involved in this kind of evidence, empirical analysis. Before opening the floor to the audience, to the participants, so I would like to know how easy was it to find data on prices in the SADC region? Because the biennial review process seems to suggest that it is hard. It is very hard to get enough data in this region. And this is related to the first question, that series of questions that we're getting from the chat box, where the first one, someone is asking, why did you stop to the month of May? I mean, the time series data to the month of May. Over to you, Greenwell.
Oh, actually, that's a very important question, Ismail. So data issues, for some of the participants, probably they came to the meeting that we had for the BR, within the SADC, and data issues came to the fore. So in the Southern Africa region, data is a challenge. I think it's also the case in East Africa, probably in West Africa as well. So to get this data, it wasn't easy, but we had to rely on other initiatives. So for example, the WFP in Malawi, and also the other initiative for the government of Zambia and the government of Mozambique. But generally, it's not easy to get it. And when you get it, it's not like it might be for 2020 or 2019, or maybe just for 5 years, when actually for some of these analysis we need long time series data. So to that extent, I would say if there are people from the governments here, one of the things to try and do is really to intensify this work on price monitoring, so that, because if we know the price trends, we can also try to infer a lot of things from that information. So let's strengthen data systems. We have not been able to present for, we would have loved to present for Zimbabwe and for South Africa and for Botswana, but we haven't been able to find similar data. That's why we have not yet kind of presented it. We hope maybe we will be able to get it as we go. Thank you. Did I answer everything, or was there another extension to the question?
Come again?
Did I answer everything?
Yeah. Except why did you stop the time series in May?
Oh yeah. That's true.
The question that Martin is asking here is: do you have the data for these markets over the past few months? It will be interesting to see if they recovered fully to where they would have been expected to track.
So actually, I think that is going to constitute the next stage in some of this work, because at the time of writing this, we did not have data for the other months, so beyond June. But I am praying and hoping that the countries have continued to collect the data, and when we touch base with them, they are going to provide that to us. And then we can also really see what is happening now after June. That would be very useful. So the reason we haven't extended the analysis to today is basically lack of data for the other months.
All right, Greenwell, thank you. I'm not able to see the hands. I guess people are able to raise their hands and ask questions. I'm seeing in the chat box a couple of questions there. So I can go through them, but at the same time, I think we have to combine them with people being able to ask questions directly. Chair, let me know if that is possible. Yes, I'm seeing the first hand here. Let's go to, yes, this is Getao. Getao, please go ahead, you have the floor.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes,
hello?
Yes, please go ahead. We can hear you, Getao. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Ismail, and thank you, Greenwell, for your presentation. I was thinking, I think you are comparing the predicted and the actual prices to say that whether the COVID has effect on the price dynamics or not. But at the same time, is it not possible to have some sort of structural break tests, like the Chow test or Haussmann test or something, I think before and after the COVID incidence? Is it not possible? Is it because the sample size you have after COVID is very small, or I don't know, is it, did you observe the prices daily or monthly? So I think sometimes it's very good to conduct those structural break tests, especially the simplest one like the Chow test and the Haussmann specification test. And so that we can, at least statistically, we can be sure that there is a disruption or structural breaks after COVID incidents. That's my question. Maybe if not possible with your data currently, for the future, I think if you get collected more data in the future, and then you can do a lot of other, even threshold analysis, we can do some threshold analysis and some switching analysis, all these things. So I think these are just comments here.
Yeah, those are good comments, Gita. I think there's nothing that would prevent us from doing that, and going forward, we can run both the structural break tests to see whether there are structural breaks, and then compare them with the predictions from the ARIMA models while controlling for seasonality. I think that's something that it would be interesting. So for probably we can consider even that for the next countries where we are doing the analysis. It's a good suggestion.
All right, thank you, Geta, for the question and the answer too. So feel free to raise your hand if you wanna ask a question directly. We also have the chat box where you can write your question directly. So let me take the second question I have here from Batista. I would like to know which criteria were used to select the 3 countries and whether they constitute a representative sample of the region for the purpose of drawing conclusions. So Tarcisio Batista is from Angola. He's a Deputy General Director for the technical area of the Institute of Rural Development of the Ministry of Agriculture and Fishery. Welcome, sir, and thank you for your question. Over to you.
Oh, Batista, you're welcome. So Batista has been a very helpful person since 2011, probably 2012, for the research program for as far as Angola is concerned. So he was even involved in data collection exercises. So I'm happy that he's here. So Batista, this work is continuing, and yes, we said for Southern Africa, but it doesn't mean that the conclusions are going to be generalized for the whole Southern Africa region. And we start saying Southern Africa, including, say, for example, Angola, there's this and that and that. No, I think we are limiting the conclusions to the countries for which the analysis are ready. For Angola, we would want to come to extend the analysis, obviously, to you. So since you're here, if there is data, if you have data for like whether it's monthly or weekly data that we can use, or daily data for price monitoring, please send it to us, and you have my email. Then we are going to do the analysis for Angola as well, so that we can see. And I think that's an important point, because in the as my colleague, maybe Sibusiso will attest to here, as well as part of our team here in Southern Africa for research, we are doing some similar analysis for Lesotho, and Lesotho is different from Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique, to the extent that the agricultural potential is kind of different. So Lesotho usually imports from South Africa, and we can't say that it's a great producer of maize. So what we're seeing in the preliminary results are completely opposite from what we're seeing in Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique, which means that we cannot just generalize on the basis of these 3 countries that's what we are going to see for all the Southern Africa countries. But I think we're seeing a pattern for the key producers of agricultural commodities in Southern Africa. They seem to have suffered from the COVID pandemic, because there was no demand for the things, for the commodities that they have. But for the countries that do not produce much, they also suffered. But the suffering was in the sense that the prices were going up. So I'm actually very eager to see after Lesotho what we are going to find in Botswana, if we manage to get a good data set, as well as in Angola and in Namibia also. Thank you.
Thank you, Greenwell, and thank you, Batista, for the question. I also want to thank Martin Fowler, the previous question on the time series, length, and why we stopped on the month of May. And Martin is an agriculture advisor at USAID Uganda. Welcome, Martin. So I have another hand here. So let me give the floor to Moroka. Moroka, you're welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you, colleagues, and good to see you. And Greenwell, great presentation, very informative. I almost want to relate to your last comments, but basically I've written the chart there, but I didn't complete everything I wanted to say as to whether you think there was any behavioral reaction just before the announcement of restrictions where buyers could do stockpiling or panic buying, which, and if that could have been the case, how could it explain, say, the observations that you have in terms of price reaction, but also whether you think that, say, panic buying could have made sure that everyone had stockpiled, in which case then the demand was not necessarily because of lack of movement, but because the buyers put enough stock that they needed. But you can also add to that as to then what could have been the psychology of the market going forward. Do you think others were thinking that the restrictions will end soon, in which case they didn't worry about getting to the markets or buying or interacting in the market, or they might have thought this may last longer time, and so we need to be prepared, in which case that issue of stockpiling, piling enough for a long time could have applied. Thank you.
Thank you, Moraka. Over to you, Green.
Thank you, Moraka. Interesting and good questions there. So the way, but maybe in the countries, some colleagues might explain it better. They might have another perspective. But the way I'm also looking at the panic buying behavior, if it's possible that, I mean, after hearing of the COVID, people started buying a lot, and then for that particular period, maybe the demand went high, etc. If that was the case, I would expect that to really happen much for in maybe, say, I would be happy to see the South African data, because I saw something to that extent for some kind of commodities, say, for example, but not agricultural ones, but some commodities, for example, maybe corned beef, etc. But it would be interesting to see if that was also the case elsewhere. What I think might differentiate the other countries from South Africa, though, would be the fact that the buying power for most of the countries, for most of the folks there, might be low. So I wouldn't expect that people would be buying a lot of maize and piling it in their houses, ready to consume during the lockdowns. I am not sure whether such would have been the case, but if it would have been the case, of course, it would have meant that maybe we would see a spike in the prices for one period, and would kind of also try to explain part of the decline later for the prices. Yeah, in which case, in terms of the implications, I think there wouldn't be a change in that. But I would, if anyone is there from the countries that we come from, if we have a different, some kind of a different experience, to the extent that maybe we would be able to say, okay, there was a lot of buying in January and February, and then people didn't go to buy simply because they already had enough. Did we observe something like that in the other countries? So I'm because here really, I'm not trying to claim that I know everything that happened in the countries, but I think it would also be useful to try and learn other channels through which the impact on prices took place.
Yeah, Green, let's hear from, there is a hand here up from Elder Zavale. Go ahead, sir, please. You have the floor, sir.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to add to this comment of a lot of buying or behavioral change that happened. Actually, in Mozambique, that did happen. And when this thing started back in January, February, and a little bit of March, not much, there were a lot of buying of many commodities and people start stocking them at home. But obviously, because of income restriction, not everybody was able to do that. It was a small portion of people who did that. And the majority, because they don't have enough income to do that, they will still rely on, I'll call, daily buying in the markets. And the price is actually that buying from this small group of people, but they're buying a lot of stuff and stocking it. It actually made prices skyrocket at that period. That's what I wanted to add as a comment.
Interesting.
All right. Thank you, sir. Greenwell, if you have something to add, please go ahead. We still have a good number of questions in the chat box. So
okay. Yeah, so I was just saying, in that case, then it's an interesting dimension to explaining the results, because what that explanation does is that it confirms the effect actually of the COVID on the behavior of the prices. So through behavioral change, it led to that. So it might even explain a bit why we saw a higher peak in around February, and then after the panic buying is done, then you see a massive drop. So that can probably help to explain that. Although I was also thinking that you will see the higher peaks in surplus areas, which are in most cases not urban centers. So which means if that was one of the major channels, then it is also saying that in the rural areas, they were doing that panic buying, which I don't know, but in town, if it was happening in the urban centers, I think it would be consistent with this kind of explanation that Eda and as well as Moraka is saying. But it's interesting, and it adds a dimension to how we can explain the impact on prices.
All right, thanks, Green. Let's move to the next question here. It's a question from Bernard. Bernard is a PhD student in agricultural economics at the University of Pretoria. So Bernard is asking, for all three countries considered, strict COVID-19 regulations were implemented. Did you or will you also consider running the model for countries which did not implement strict controls? It will be interesting to compare the two policy measures. Over to you, Greg.
You know, I like that, because then it is also, I think, almost speaking to what we are already kind of thinking about. Yeah, it will be interesting to see, to come up with an indicator of the degree of confinements across the SADC region, for example, and then try to see the effect on prices to that. And then I try to attribute that. If we do that, then we might start talking more about causality issues. And I think it would be interesting. But as we said, for now, data limitations are key. So if we go and we start finding data, say, for example, for South Africa, then we can already start constructing some indices on the degree of confinements, because we know what was happening in South Africa. If we find information for Mauritius as well as for the other countries, yeah, then we can definitely try to test that. It's an important comment.
Yes, indeed. That's a good one. Thanks, Bernard. So we have another one, asking again which criteria was used to select the countries. But the follow-up question is, I was expecting prices to escalate, but they are declining. Is it because of high production such that there is a surplus? So that's a question from Seboka, and Seboka is from the Kingdom of Lesotho. He's at the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security. Thank you, sir. Over to you, Greg.
That's a good question, because I think, given that I already also know, at least what he's saying is indeed what is happening, say, for example, in some countries in West Africa, from the data that we're seeing, like in Senegal, I think we saw something like that. And for his own country, Sabuga, for your own country, Lesotho, that's also what we are seeing. The only thing is we have not finished the analysis. That's why we have not presented it here. So yeah, the part of the reason why we are seeing a depression in prices in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zambia is related to the fact that these are heavy agrarian countries. They rely so much on agriculture. They have tremendous potential in terms of agricultural production. And in fact, when it comes to cereal trade within the SADC region, these are some of the key ones, especially Zambia and Malawi. These are key, and South Africa. They feed this, they export a lot into the SADC region when it comes to cereals. But Mozambique too is a great producer of a lot of things. They have, the Zambezia, Tete, Nampula, they produce a lot. So I think what would be happening here is the fact that because there's key producers of those commodities, and since the COVID period meant that they could, market activities were kind of halted or at least disrupted, or they were limited, then prices across the board went down. And yes, you're right, there was also the added effect of the new season coming. So both for Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia, there is also kind of, the harvest season starts around, say, April, May, going forwards. So that might also obviously have had a kind of an effect on that. But what we said earlier on is that if you compare 2019 and 2020, you'll find that yes, within this period, within the first half of the year, especially from February to around June, you still expect that there will be some depression in terms of prices, a decline in prices for commodities. But the decline in 2020 has been unprecedented. It's much more compared to the previous ones. And that you are able to see from the ARIMA models, as well as from difference in different kind of analysis. So yes, part of the reasons is to do with the harvest.
That one,
okay.
There is Martin who was asking, are you sure that the harvest in 2020 was not higher than in 2019, resulting in greater availability of maize supply? And then while COVID is also have led to a reduction of consumption, meaning demand. Have you also been able to analyze the trade data to confirm the reduction in export and import here in maize compared to the previous years? So basically you have the production part also is asking whether you have analyzed that data, but also the trade part.
So I think
2019. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the limitations in terms of how we can explain this is the fact that we have not dealt with the actual, actual import and exports data. But when you speak, and I'm glad that we have representatives from the countries, from Malawi, I'm pretty sure they're here, as well as Zambia. I think what we're getting anecdotally is the fact that once they closed the borders, there wasn't much trading activity. So even in the absence of exact figures, you know that over that period of time, there was not much trade going on across the borders. And in terms of trying to think that maybe it was 2020 for both Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique. These were special years, maybe climate was great. I do not have much information on that except to say that for Malawi and Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and I think part of Zambia, this was not a good year for agricultural production because there were floods also. So some of the produce which was expected did not materialize because it was swept by floods, at least in Mozambique, Malawi, etc. So if I am to expect anything in terms of the production figures, it might by the end of the day mean that actually they did not produce much more. But I would love to hear from, say, whether it's Helder or Musopole in Malawi, or maybe Christopher in Zambia, or Derek if they are here, to see if there was a lot of production in their country.
All right, thanks, thanks, Grain. Before they come in, let's give the floor to Julie. Julie, over to you.
Thanks, Ismail. Thanks, Greenwell, for the presentation. I was just wondering if some of the price decline, even in deficit areas, could be due to reduced purchasing power of consumers, because I know that in some countries, reduced employment and reduced incomes led people to reduce their food expenditures. And I just opened up the LSMS. So LSMS has done phone surveys of households in Malawi looking at effects on COVID. And I saw that households that reported shocks, a large percentage of them responded by reducing food expenditures. So I'm wondering if that could be one of the reasons, in addition to reduced marketing activities, for price declines in urban areas and other deficit areas. Thanks.
Actually, that's very important line of thought. That's very, very possible. What we know, at least from the reports that we are getting, is that as a result of because most of the urban, most of the deficit areas, these are urban centers where a lot of people rely on small-scale businesses, which were actually heavily hit. So I can easily see why that is the case. So that is likely one of the reasons why the demand in the urban centers might have gone down, because a lot of people lost their jobs. So although this is not what we expressly find in this, but I think that's the story you're also getting from the anecdotes from the countries, from the newspapers, etc.
All right, thanks, thanks, Green. I have another question here from from Martin, asking, could you not have found out a lot of the information you have presented and the conclusions you arrived at simply by asking private sector grain traders what was happening? I'm sure they will have confirmed, rejected several of your conclusions and recommendations. Green.
Oh, right. Okay. So he's talking about the possibility of a survey. Maybe that would be an interesting extension also going forward. And it kind of is speaking to what we were discussing as researchers recently, that there might also be need in terms of when we're expanding the work to start surveys that are going to target businesses, etc. Without preempting, but I think it's an interesting coincidence. So that would be something that would be interesting as we try to explain most of the trends that we are seeing. We might need to implement a little survey.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Green, for that one. We have Antoinette Salah from the farming. From farming and food it's a farming and food consultant. And then Antoinette is asking, your presentation focused on arable crops. Any information on markets and the price fluctuations on livestock and other agricultural products? Over to you, Green. Thanks, Antoinette.
Wow, so I like most of the questions because they're also speaking to the fact that it would be useful to expand this work to many commodities as well, even beyond crops. And yes, for Malawi, we do not have prices for livestock and other things, but I think for is it Zambia or Mozambique, there's somewhere where we have some limited data on milk products, etc. But I haven't seen in the data anything like, for example, beef or something. So one of our limitations, actually, as we extend this, and I would like to promise that we are going to cover animal products, but I must also caution in advance that if we don't, it's not because we don't want or we think that animal products are not useful. They are very useful, but the data sometimes is not readily available. So for Malawi, at least I can remember in the database we're seeing, there is nothing about livestock. So if if there are Malawi representatives here, maybe that's a challenge to you to provide us some data to the extent that we can do those analyses. And the same for Zambia as well as for Mozambique and the other countries indeed that are here. I would love to have us analyze livestock dynamics in prices for livestock commodities. I mean livestock products, milk, etc. But we do not have sufficient data for that at present.
All right. All right. Thanks, Green. Please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. You can ask your question directly if you wish to. We still have a couple of them here. I mean, Gabrielle saying, I think, I mean, can you kindly extend this model to livestock sector? I mean, the comment that you made, earlier. And there's also another comment on if you this analysis can be extended to more countries, in particular Lesotho. So they're looking forward to also have this analysis covered their country. Any question from the audience?
But Ismail, just for Lesotho, I think, yeah, I said maybe before he came, before the colleague who is asking came, but for Lesotho, at least they provided some information. So we're doing the analysis, only that we have not yet completed it. So we will have a bulletin and the results for Lesotho. So similarly for the other countries, please avail data to us. We should be able to do the analysis.
Right. So Green, you have Elde Zavale, who's from the Eduardo Mondlane University in Mozambique, who's confirming that regarding the production issue, I don't have the production data for 2020, but based on weather, 2020 should not be a good production year, as Greenwell indicated. All right, this is just...
Yeah, I would agree with him because there was a lot of, I remember, I mean, there was a lot of problems, at least in terms of also the floods. The floods, in some cases, they came at a time which was critical for agricultural production. And at a time when, after the crops had gone, people wouldn't regrow them because they wouldn't have enough time. So I think I tend to concur with him. If it is special year, it must be special in the sense that there won't be superior production.
All right. Thanks, Greenwell. Any more questions from the audience? Greenwell, can you tell us a little bit, what is the nature of trade between the three countries, Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique?
Right. So Malawi, Zambia and Mozambique, it's unfortunate I did not present a map here, but for those who don't know, Malawi borders Mozambique and Zambia. So these are like a triangulate of countries. They border each other, and there's loads of formal trade between them, and there's also a lot of cross-border trade between them. And they trade in commodities, including maize, although both of them produce a lot. But since there is spatial differences in terms of where they produce what, you'll find that there's still significant amount of trade. So Nchinji district, for example, in Malawi trades a lot with bordering the Eastern Province in Zambia. And similarly in Sanje, trades a lot with Milanje in Mozambique, and vice versa. So there's flow of commodities from both countries. So that's why I'm also thinking that the theory that the closure of the borders might have led to problems in terms of clearing of markets must be true. It's simply because they trade a lot together, even in cereals. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Greenwell. And I guess there are lessons to learn here, you know, when on the frequent travel bans that we often see in the region, you know, in which some commodities are prohibited, you know, abruptly from export. So the studies, this analysis, you know, help us to learn more about, you know, those kind of measures in countries in normal year. Go ahead, yeah. How about you?
Yeah, that's true, Ismail. So think about this. I tend to look at the COVID as something that has just happened, of course, but it has also acted like an abrupt ban on trade because countries had to close. And the effects are what we're seeing, a depression in prices in areas with high production, and a skyrocketing of prices in some areas which are deficit areas, especially across the border. So although we have not presented the data, the results for Lesotho, what I can tell you is that what we are seeing there is that it's a complete opposite of what we're seeing in these food surplus countries like Mozambique, Malawi, and Zambia. In Lesotho, there is a general increase in the prices and an unusual increase in the COVID period. When you look at Lesotho, and I'm glad the Lesotho colleagues are here, they import a lot of their foodstuffs from South Africa, and South Africa implemented a very strong lockdown at some point. So you would think that probably that also contributed to the prices going up there. And that's just an example. But you do also think that that might have happened with respect to, say, for example, Botswana and its neighbors, South Africa or Namibia, etc., and actually maybe even Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe, as much as it used to be a grain basket, for now they're still kind of also importing a lot from South Africa, Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique. So we would expect that there would be some difference, a differential. I mean, the response there might be slightly different from Malawi and Mozambique, to the extent that they import more of the commodities there. So the lesson is that let's try probably to find other means rather than just banning trade when we think it's necessary. We tend to harm a lot of people, not only in our countries, but also in the region. In this case, trade bans in the surplus countries are leading to low prices, which might harm our producers and aggregators, and those in small businesses dealing in commodities. And it's also harming others outside the countries, those people who rely, or those countries that rely on on exports from our countries.
All right. Thank you very much, Greenwell. Thank you for the presentation and for answering the questions. We are now we're at the end of this webinar. I would like to thank all the participants for the time made for this webinar. More information on our webinar series is available on academia2063.org. Then I can just say bye for now, and look forward to seeing you next week in our next webinar series. Thank you very much. Thank you.